So now let's think a little bit about, in our final little section, which is the notion of an interaction-based effective training. How do all of these kind of parameters interact with each other, and what are the ramifications of this? And we're going to do this by just using some simple models to perhaps try and explain this a little bit. And this is using some very simple representations. So we saw this right at the start of this presentation. Here we've got our training load, and here we've got our genetic endowment. And the net result is we get both performance and health-based responses, both positive and negative. Remember that you get some people who get significant adaptation, some people who don't. However, it is a bit more complicated than that. So we can look at this in two ways. We've got what is called a multivariate concept, which is in panel B, where there is kind of no direct interaction, and then in C, where we've got an interaction in the multivariate concept. And it's almost certainly that C is perhaps a greater representation of what is going on. So we'll focus on C because it perhaps works better for us. So we've got our training load and we've got our genetics, as we've got here, but what's happening is it's the interaction between all of these segments here. So for example, the age and the epigenetics of the individual. Remember I talked about their genetic status, but also it's the kind of the additional factors of diet and health and whether they're taking any medication. All of these combine to influence the outcome effect. We can't really view training as we've got in panel B, because panel B is kind of saying, well, nothing interacts with each other. It absolutely does. And it really lends itself to explaining why we saw such variability in the data very early on in this presentation in relation to the sprint interval training and the strength training that we saw, because it's understanding everybody's slightly different. Everybody has different genetic kind of predispositions, epigenetics, but also everybody has different health status. And all of those combined together, even though we might be applying the same training load, will yield different biological responses. And if we take this a little bit further, this is from a really classic book which was published by a guy called Frank Dick. Frank Dick was actually the head of performance for British Athletics for a number of years. Very, very interesting guy to perhaps listen to. But what he's doing is taking it a stage further for us, which is really where we're going to start to conclude this session, which is you've got the intensity, the frequency, duration. Now start to think about the components of fitness. Now start to think about the fact that when we're training an athlete, we've got to think about the fact that strength, power, speed, aerobic endurance, anaerobic endurance, range of motion, body composition, all of those factors interact, and each of those will be trained at a different intensity or a different load volume basis to produce the desired biological response. So we've been thinking about intensity, frequency, duration. Now you've got to think about the fact that if I've got, for example, a Tour de France cyclist, as an example, you think, well, it's endurance. Yes, it is endurance. It's absolutely aerobic endurance, but there needs to be an awful lot of strength because you've got to be able to cycle for 7 hours. It might not be about muscle hypertrophy, but they've got to be strong. They've got to be able to accelerate, so power becomes important. So suddenly you think, well, I've got to train all of those components of fitness. And the degree to which we get biological adaptation, as we've seen with our strength data in this session, varies depending upon those components of fitness. So 80% of 1 rep max, which is 80% of kind of the max lift, so 80% of the kind of the max load may not be the same as needed for power, may not be the same as needed for endurance. So having to recognise that each of these components of fitness will need a different application of understanding in terms of load and volume. And then the final way to think of this, I think, is the notion of a Rubik's Cube. I'm a huge fan of Rubik's Cubes. I think they're a great pastime. And what I've got here is we've got a Rubik's Cube. And what we've got is on each of these 3 faces, we've highlighted some of the characteristics which are potentially important to this as a response. So the blue panel here is some of the key biological responses that are important to aerobic endurance. So for things like oxygen deficit, mitochondrial density, aerobic enzymes, oxygen consumption, heart size, not surprising, lactate, capillary density, glycogen content, carbohydrate use, those kind of things. And then on our this panel over here, so this panel here, we've got things, this is relation to, for example, more power-based adaptations, so lactate, contraction speed, capillary density, muscle mass, PCR stores, satellite cells, fiber size, neurological adaptations. So each face, what I want you to think is referring to a component of fitness. But this is where training gets really complicated, as we'll get into in subsequent sessions. Think about that notion of training. Think about that Tour de France cyclist I mentioned a moment ago, where we said they've got to train for endurance, they've got to train for speed, they've got to train for power, they've got to train for strength, they've probably got to train to some degree for range of motion. Now, the relative importance of each of those is determined by their underlying genetic endowment, it's dependent upon the sport, it's dependent upon the experience of the athlete. But fundamentally, we've got to train all those characteristics, which means you've probably got to train all those characteristics not necessarily in the same session, but certainly within the same training period. Because I can't just train endurance on its own, because that means I haven't done strength. So I might do an endurance session in the morning, I might do a strength session in the afternoon. Why is that important? Because this is what happens. Excuse me. We start to get an interactory effect. Each of those components of fitness will interact with another component of fitness. And so the net result is that what starts to happen is you might be doing, say, endurance and strength training, because that's what you need. Those are the fundamental two important characteristics. Great. But what we now start to understand is they interact with each other. We know one of the key biological adaptations with strength training is that we get things like angiogenesis, we get capillarization, we get an increase in aerobic enzyme activity and mitochondrial density. What we know with strength training is strength training down-regulates those. So strength training is actually associated with reductions in capillary density, reductions in angiogenesis, reductions in mitochondrial density. That's detrimental to endurance performance. So this is where training starts to become much, much more nuanced, and understanding, as we will look at in subsequent sessions, how you balance the needs of each of those components of fitness in terms of trying to produce the optimal biological gain.